Every gilded cage is built with walls of comfort. The only question is what you're paying for them.
Today, we're digging into Naomi Klein's really influential and, let's be honest, pretty controversial book, The Shock Doctrine. The whole idea is that there's a startling connection between psychiatric torture and the way our global economy works. It's a wild ride, so let's get right into it.
So this whole thing doesn't start with a big economic theory. It starts with a person. This quote is from a woman named Gail Kastner, who, for most of her life, had this huge, terrifying blank spot in her memory. She couldn't remember anything before she was 20. Her search for why led her to these really disturbing experiments.
And the man at the center of it all was this guy, Dr. Ewan Cameron. Now, he was a pretty famous psychiatrist, and he was getting money from the CIA to figure out how to completely wipe a person's mind. The goal, believe it or not, was to turn them into a blank slate, kind of like a baby, so you could just build a whole new personality from the ground up. It's a truly horrifying story, right? A story of deep personal trauma. But this is where the book makes its big leap. It asks, what if you could do that same thing? Use a massive shock to create a blank slate, not just on one person, but on an entire society. And that right there is the central idea of the book. It draws this direct line from the shock therapy used on the mind to what it calls shock therapy for a whole society. So here's the comparison the book makes. On the one hand, you have an individual who's hit with an overwhelming shock to wipe their personality clean. And on the other hand, you have a whole country that goes through some huge crisis, a war, a natural disaster, an economic crash. And that crisis is used as the shock to wipe away old policies and create a clean sheet for some really radical economic changes. Okay, so let's put a pin in that and get a really clear definition. What is the shock doctrine, according to the book? At its core, the theory is pretty simple. It's the idea that during a huge collective trauma, when everyone is scared and disoriented, that's the moment when powerful groups push through radical free market policies so fast that nobody even has a chance to fight back, things they would never, ever agree to in normal times. And the book argues that this follows a kind of playbook, a three-step process. First, you need the shock, the big crises. Second, while everyone is still reeling, you ram through the economic reforms. And third, you use a beefed-up security and police state to manage the fallout and make sure these new, often painful policies stick. So where did these economic ideas even come from? Well, the book points its finger at one person in particular, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman. And this quote from a letter he actually wrote to the Chilean dictator Pinochet really gets to the heart of his philosophy. That government spending on the public good is just fundamentally wrong. Now, the book doesn't just leave this as a theory. It lays out a whole series of historical case studies to argue that this same pattern has played out over and over again, all across the world. And you can see the alleged pattern here. In places like Chile and Argentina, the shock was a violent military coup that opened the door for these economic experiments. In Russia, it was a constitutional crisis. And much more recently, in the United States, the book argues it was Hurricane Katrina that created the opening to completely remake New Orleans. So let's zoom in on that first example, Chile in 1973. The book presents this as the first real-world laboratory for the shock doctrine. The violent coup that overthrew the elected government created a state of absolute terror. And that, it argues, was the perfect shock needed for the economic experiment that came next. And the economic results of these policies, according to the book, were just immediate and devastating for ordinary people. It points to neighboring Argentina, which had its own coup a few years later. As similar policies were put in place there by force, workers' wages lost a staggering 40% of their value in a single year. That just shows you how fast and severe the pain was. Okay, so now let's jump forward about 30 years. The book claims that the absolute devastation of Hurricane Katrina acted as the same kind of shock. It created this window of opportunity to rebuild the city in a way that would have been completely impossible politically before the storm hit. And this quote right here is presented in the book as the perfect example of the shock doctrine mindset in action. It was said by a Republican congressman to a group of lobbyists right after the hurricane. You can see how a disaster isn't just seen as a tragedy to fix, but as a chance for a clean sheet, a golden opportunity to push an agenda that was already waiting in the wings. So the book argues this isn't just a bunch of random, one-off events. It claims that a whole new, interconnected system has sprung up, something it calls the disaster capitalism complex. So what does that mean? Well, it's the idea that war, disaster relief, and national security have all become these massive for-profit industries. The book argues that after 9/11, the war on terror especially created this state of permanent crisis, which means there's a constant, never-ending stream of government contracts for this new private infrastructure. And that's really the heart of the theory in the Shock Doctrine. It offers this lens to look at world events, connecting something as personal as individual trauma to the vast forces of global economics. And it leaves us with this one final, really crucial question. When a crisis hits, who really stands to profit from the chaos? Thanks for joining me.